All right, how's it going, everyone? Let me see. What's good? Got my boy Mickey Mouse. You know what I'm saying? I wasn't really a fan of Mickey Mouse. I kind of liked Elmo a little bit more. When I was a little baby. I have There's like an old Elmo doll that I don't know where it is. I might post like a photo on the page, but whatever. So what's going on? This is the pretty much the first video on the Patreon. It's a tutorial pretty much. Well, not a tutorial. I'm not walking you through anything. I'm just gonna explain something that I didn't get to explain on my YouTube channel, right? So if you've watched my videos on YouTube, I kind of was starting a photography guide. Now I'm putting this on Patreon because why not, right? So we talked about shutter speed. We talked about what aperture and ISO are. We talked about aperture specifically. This time we're going to talk about focal lengths. We're going to talk about focal lengths and the difference between them, and we're not going to do it in 30 minutes. We're going to do it in less than 10, right? So first, let's take out a camera, right? This right here, this sucker is the Sony A7 III. Don't mind the tape. I live in a bad neighborhood, so so Sony A7 III with the Tamron 28-75. Now I'm gonna explain what that actually means, 28-75. All right. So as you know, cameras that can swap out lenses, or pretty much any camera, they have a lens. Typically, there are lenses on these cameras. You have your little instant cameras, you have your little whatever. There are lenses on them. These suckers, right? That's how you're supposed to take your photos. You can't take your photos just like this with the sensor open. No. You can't do that, right? So, obviously, with these kinds of cameras where you can switch the lenses, or whatever camera you're using, your lens is gonna have a specific focal length. What does that mean? Focal length. So when you hear somebody say, I have a 100mm lens, or a 200mm lens, or a 14mm lens, right? What does that mean? That pretty much means, okay, I have a lens, right? But my lens can zoom in or take in this much of a perspective, right? Like how much of a frame am I taking in, right? So let's say this, right? My lens goes from 28mm to 75mm, okay? And I'm gonna take a couple photos right now. So let me just get this real quick of my camera. Of my, real quick, gotta swap to my other card. All right. So take a photo of me right now. Okay, that's a 28mm. Now let me zoom in, right, to 75, and I'll take a photo right now. All right, somebody just walked by my window, but that's not a problem. Okay, take a look. So this is at 28mm. Okay, it's pretty wide. It's not that, I'm kind of close to the thing right now. I'm not that far away, but it's pretty wide, right? 28mm. Now, if we go to 75mm, look at the difference. It's much tighter, and I'm still at the same spot. I'm still the same distance pretty much. So it's much tighter, the frame, right? So based on that, right, what you can guess is that lower millimeters, lower focal lengths, lower than, let's say, like 14mm, 18mm, 20mm, 28mm, those lower focal lengths pretty much mean that my picture, whatever I'm shooting, is gonna be wider, right? I'm gonna take in much more in my photo, right? Now, if we go increase that focal length, if we increase that number, let's say instead of 28mm, we go up to 50, or we go to 100, or even 200, or even, I don't know, 500 sometimes, 600, if you have that much money to buy those lenses, okay? If you go up in your focal length, you're going to take in less of an image. You're going to have less of a frame, right? It's going to be tighter. Whatever you're taking a photo of will be pretty much like shrunken in a sense, if you want to think of it like that, right? So like your frame is decreasing, okay? What you're not getting in as much details of the surroundings, you know, everything is focused on one thing, you know. That's what happens when you have a bigger focal length, okay? Keep that in mind. So I can't go into specifics like, oh, this is why it's called focal length and all this. I can't, right? I'm not the best at that. I just got a notification. I'm not the best at that, but I know what it means, right? Okay, so why am I getting messages? Okay, so just to go over that again, because I was a little all over the place. Focal length pretty much means how much can I fit into my photo at one time. How much can I fit into my photo at one time, right? So if you have a lower focal length, right, let's say 28 millimeters, lower focal length, you are fitting a good amount into your image, right? I'll take a photo right now. You are fitting a good amount into your image. If you have a higher focal length, if we increase that to maybe like just 50, right? If we increase that to 50, your frame, you're not getting as much, you know, stuff in the surroundings. Your frame is getting smaller. It's like cropping in, right? Instead, you're not losing detail. You're just zooming in, right? It's like cropping your image when you increase the focal length, okay? All right, so now I want to tell you, apart from focal lengths, I want to tell you the difference between prime and zoom lenses, okay? So this sucker right here, just pulled out of thin air, no, really my bag. This sucker right here is an 85 millimeter, okay? Now, guess what's the difference between a 28 millimeter focal length and an 85 millimeter from what we just said? The 28 millimeter focal length is gonna be much wider. You're gonna get a lot more in that photo, right? It's gonna be huge, it's gonna be much wider than an 85 millimeter, right? An 85 millimeter lens is gonna be much tighter. The photos will be much tighter. You will get less of everything in your frame. There will be less in your frame. It'll be much more zoomed in, right? The difference between this lens and this lens, right? If you can see that right there, is that this lens is at a fixed focal length. It's called a prime lens, right? So it only has one focal length. You see that I can't zoom in or out with this lens. The lens only stays at one focal length. Whereas with my 28 to 75, I can go from 28 millimeters, right, to 75 millimeters. This zooms in and out, okay? That's pretty much the difference between zoom lenses and prime lenses. Prime lenses, I think of like, what do I think about? I think about prime numbers, because I like math, right? So when I hear prime lenses, I think prime numbers, because they can only, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, if you know math, I don't know it that well. Prime lenses, or I mean prime numbers, they can only be multiplied. Like they only have two factors, right? The number itself times 1, right? So 1 and the number itself, it can only do that. So maybe like the number 2, right? The only factors for 2 are 1 and 2, right? Because you can only, you're able to get 2, right? With whole numbers. Anyway, enough of the math stuff, right? That's how I like to think of it. Prime numbers, you know? It can only be one thing, right? So, obviously, there are big problems with prime lenses, you know? Let's say if you're doing like a wedding, right? If you're doing a wedding and you want to get like a group shot. I've had those problems before. If you want to get like a group shot of maybe like 5 people, you're using like an 85 millimeter, right? What's the problem with this? You're using an 85 millimeter. This thing pretty much zooms in, right? It's very tight. The frame that you get from this in the photo is very tight. It's not as much like, you can't do like a wide photo from close up, right? Like if we're from this distance to this distance, my frame would be very, very small. I would pretty much be getting only the phone in my frame, right? If I were using an 85 millimeter from this distance, right? It's a very tight frame. This lens, I mean, typically it's used for portraits, right? But for group shots, you do not want to use an 85 sometimes, because what's gonna happen is you want to get everyone in the frame, right? So what you're gonna have to do is take like 20 steps back or 10 steps back and go far away, right? Now sometimes maybe that's what you want. Who knows? Maybe that is what you want. Maybe you want to yell at the group of people that are just standing there waiting for you to, you know, back up and take photos. Or what you do want is a wider lens, a lower focal length, right? Because you can just stand like right in front of that group with, like, let's say 28 millimeters, stand right in front of that group, not having to take that many steps back, letting them be able to hear you, right? And be able to take that photo like that quickly, right? And when it comes to those situations like weddings, events, you know, things like that, that is very key. That is pretty vital sometimes. It can be very important, right? For portraits, if you're doing like a photo shoot, doesn't really matter. You can take a couple steps back because you're only taking a photo of one person, right? Unless you're running out of time, then whatever. So what I'm trying to say is different lenses are going to do different jobs. Okay? They will have different purposes, and they will fit your needs differently. Right? If you take a bunch of group shots, or if you take, like, let's say architecture photos, and you know, you take pictures of buildings and you want, you know, big frames, you want to have like everything wide and beautiful and everything in the frame, get a wide lens. Get something that's below 28 millimeters, right? A low focal length. Okay? If you want, you know, tight shots, if you want, you know, nice, what is it? If you want, how do you say this? A tight frame, right? Like, let's say if you're doing portraits and you only want to take a photo of one person and you want, you know, a tight frame in that photo, right? What's going to happen is you would want an 85 millimeter or anything above that, right? 50 millimeter, if you want a tight frame though, you want a really tight frame, maybe like a headshot or just like a, you know, from the chest or the waist, you would use an 85 millimeter or above, right? Like 100 millimeter, 135 millimeter, 200 millimeters, right? But, you know, keep in mind those things get expensive, right? Anyway, you would use those lenses for specific things, but keep in mind, it all depends on your preference. What do you like in your portraits? Or what do you like in your wildlife photography? Or what do you like in your architecture photos? Or makeup photos? Or product photos? What do you prefer as a photographer, right? That will dictate what you will use for your focal length. But just keep in mind, lower focal lengths pretty much mean wider photos. Higher focal lengths mean tighter photos, tighter frames, right? Less stuff is going to be in that frame. Okay? Yeah, that's about it. I could talk about compression, right? But I'll talk about that another time because, you know, it changes when you use different lenses. You know, if you have like a higher focal length, the compression. Okay, I'm not going to talk about compression. You want to know why? Because some people say it's fake. I like calling it image compression. I like calling compression, you know, or whatever happens when you have a longer focal length. I like saying, or higher focal length, excuse me, like 85 millimeters, 135 millimeters, you know, higher numbers, right? I like saying image compression because it's a simple thing to say. You don't have to keep in mind the science and stuff, but we could talk about that in another video, right? Anyway, that's about it. Thank you for joining the Patreon if you joined it. Yeah, see you guys next time. Have a good one.